All right, it looks like streaming has started, so I'm going to go ahead and get our panel started. Our panel tonight is called As If Your Life Depends on It, Voting and Disability. Thank you everyone so much for joining our panel tonight. Before we get started, I'm just going to start off with a moment of silence in memory of Lois Curtis, who passed away last week. Lois Curtis was one of the plaintiffs in Olmstead v. LC, a Supreme Court case whose ruling allows disabled people to receive services in the community. For more information about Lois, you can check out ASAN's statement commemorating her life, which is linked in the chat. We'll begin the moment of silence now. Thank you so much. The next thing is we wanted to quickly explain why we're using the title As If Your Life Depends on It for this session. This is a quote from Justin Dart, a disability rights activist and key figure in the passing of the Americans with Disabilities Act. The full quote is, "Vote as if your life depends on it because it does." So today was election day. Every election day, we hear from people in the news about long lines, inaccessible polling places, and other barriers that our community faces to voting. As we're watching the results come in, let's spend some time together reflecting on the many barriers to voting in the United States for people with disabilities, for people of color, and other marginalized communities. And let's talk about how we can make change. With that, I would like to begin the panel by asking each of our panelists to tell us a little bit about yourself, your name, your pronouns, if you use any, and talk about the work that you do related to voting and disability. Who would like to go first? I could also go ahead in alphabetical order. So Ben, if you want to start off.
Okay, thank you. My name is Ben Bro, and I use he, him, his pronouns. I am a non-speaking autistic with apraxia, epilepsy, and OCD. I have written many articles for numerous autism and differently abled advocacy groups, both in the US and worldwide, and am a proud representative for my community on several advocacy boards and committees, both in the state of Virginia and nationally. I am growing my resume and experience as a public speaker, advisor, and journalist representing non-speaking autistics and those people with disabilities in general. I feel it is very important that minimal and unreliably speaking autistics have equal rights, opportunities, and voices in society. I share my beliefs and impressions on my public Facebook page, Ben B, my own words, Reflections of a Non-Speaking Autistic, Instagram, and just recently on TikTok.
Awesome, thank you so much, Ben. How about you, Alyssa?
Sure. Hi, my name is Alyssa Gershon. My pronouns are she, her, and I am an attorney. I'm on contract with the National Disability Rights Network, where I work on voting rights and guardianship. So specifically, I develop informational materials and I do trainings around voting competency and the right to accommodations and materials to help people advocate to restore or retain the right to vote in a guardianship proceeding.
Thank you so much. Awesome. Hector, how about you?
Hi, good evening, everybody. My name is Hector Ramirez. My pronouns are they, them. I am Chiricahua Apache and Mexican, and I am speaking to all of you today from the unceded ancestral lands of the Tongva people here in what they call Los Angeles. It's a tiny little part here in California. I'm on the board of directors with Disability Rights California and the National Disability Rights Network. I'm a disability rights advocate. I am autistic. I have mental health condition, a psychiatric disability, and I'm hard of hearing. I'm somebody who comes from an institution, pre-ADA. I spent my early life, and I was able to get out because of the work that a protection advocacy agency here in California did, and that's why I'm on those boards. I've been working nonstop, and I think one of the things that I do around voting, I totally believe the fact that, you know, as a Native person, as a person with a disability, you know, that we vote every day because our lives, the lives of our loved ones, the lives of our communities matter. And it's so sad that every single time that there's an election that we have to keep going to the voting booths because our lives matter. You know, it's just ridiculous. As people with disabilities, as a member of a marginalized community, I know how important it is that, you know, not only we be available to vote, but other communities to vote, because every aspect of our life we have to fight for. Literally every part of our lives we have to fight for as people with disabilities, and it's been a long battle that started way before me, and I hope that it would not have to be something that folks have to do long after I'm gone. But I know that we have great advocates as well, because as people with disabilities, you know, we are, especially during the pandemic, became very clear disposable by our elected officials, by our communities, and they forget the fact that we are residents like everybody else that have civil right to exercise this, because voting is not a privilege. Don't ever let anybody tell you that. It's a right, and it's your right. And if anybody knows anything about disability rights, it's people with disabilities. And that's one of the things that I do. My mom and my family work right now for days on voting programs, and one of the things that I've been doing is I've been monitoring from home any type of voting violations that are happening both in my state and nationwide. As a board member, I help to oversee the protection advocacy that exists in all 50 states in the United States and U.S. territories, and voting is our most fundamental kind of issue that we focus on, making sure that all of us have a right to vote, because that's one of the big ways that we kind of fight the system, not only to get out of institutions, but get jobs and all sorts of other things that other people take for granted, because they don't have it taken away like we do. And so I'm really grateful to be here with everybody else. Sometimes after I speak, I turn my camera out because I get nervous. It's just kind of my autistic thing. I'm just sharing it in this space.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Teresa, how about you?
Hello, everyone. My name is Teresa Moore. I am in Arizona. My pronouns are she and her, and I am part of Self Advocates Becoming Empowered, which has a Go Voter project. We also have a national project called the Self Advocacy Technical Assistance and Resource Center. And through both of those projects, we seek to assist individuals with developmental and intellectual and cognitive disabilities to learn about their rights in voting and other things through life, and how important voting does affect all of those things that we do need in our everyday life, from services to things in our community, to access to information, making it friendly and easy to use, easy to find, easy to go through and learn about, and be able to take part in the voting process is one of our biggest goals. We've been doing this for over 20 years. When we first started, a lot of the people that we talked to across the country, because of our national connection, many people with intellectual and developmental and cognitive disabilities were telling us that people told them all their life that they weren't smart enough to vote and that they didn't have that right. And being over 20 years ago and still finding that happening was just heartbreaking to us at SAVE, to have people feel that way so deeply hurt by the messages that they had heard throughout their lives that they weren't smart enough. And so we set out to create a training that people could learn about the voting process and how important everyday decisions can become part of the voting process. And through this training, we've been able to offer it to all across the country. And then a few years ago, we started partnering with the National Disability Rights Network to work with the protection and advocacy organizations in states, often called the disability rights organizations now. And so we work with them to help self-advocates do our training in their states and to learn what the laws are, because we find that they're ever changing and that self-advocates and individuals with disabilities needed some assistance sometimes understanding what those changes were and to incorporate that into our training. And we also found that there was a benefit for the Disability Rights Network's partners to learn about how you can relay this information to people's everyday lives and to make it meaningful for them, to make it understandable and usable by them, and to learn why they are such an important part of the process. So that's what we do at SAVE.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It's been great to hear and get to know all of our panelists this evening. The next question I'd like to address is why it is important to vote. So what issues do state, local, and national elections impact? What kind of change can we make by voting? I just opened this up to any of our panelists who'd like to address this. I see, Ben, your hand is raised. Go ahead.
These local and state elections matter more for your everyday issues. This includes school, community, and police funding, passing laws, and so many other things. If you want to have positive action in your community, local and state elections are a great place to start.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Anyone else?
This is Alyssa. I could just add that so many things that affect people's lives, like housing, transportation, education, voting rights, are things that are decided at the state and local level. And in addition to important races where people who will advocate for those rights in ways that you want them to are on the ballot at every level, whether it's city council or district attorney or judges sometimes, or state legislators. Every single one of those races is really, really important to people's lives. And in addition to the races where candidates are running, there are often ballot measures that have a huge impact on our everyday lives, including things like sales tax that might go to pay for improved transportation. So those are all things on the ballot, and it's really important to make sure to not just look at the top of the ticket, who's running for president, who's running for senator, but to be informed about and make your voice heard at every level in an election. And I just want to add that I know it's I'm on the West Coast in California. The polling places are still open. So in many places, if people are listening and they haven't voted yet, there might still be time. So it's not too late in some places. And if you haven't voted, check it out and get off of this webinar and go vote before it's too late.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Alyssa. Hector, go ahead.
This is Hector. Definitely. If you're in line, stay in line. Stay in line. You know, or you can, if you're shook and go. And I think, you know, like in Indian country, in our community, one of the things that we say is that every issue is a native issue. Every issue on anything that people are voting impacts, you know, our native community. The same thing for the disability community. Everything on that ballot impacts negatively or positively the disability community. Everything from who gets elected, what they're voting on or what they're not voting on. Here in Los Angeles County, I mean, we have our mayor race, which is a big thing. We have one of our boards of supervisors, which is a big thing because they oversee the budget, which pays for services and appoints people to commissions. At the state level, our governor is running again he's going to win. But, those sorts of things really have an impact at the national level. Women's rights are on the table. Okay, that's a huge thing. Gun violence, it's on the table. There's a lot of every issue, everything on the ballot. And, one of the things that I have really liked and I love about the work that Hassan done around plain language is that one of the things that, and I learned this from my mom because she works at voting centers and she trains people in accessibility. And she teaches she uses the Hassan example on plain language here in California. And one of the things that she learned is that when people come to the table with their ballot, they can say, how does this impact disability? Can you explain this to me? Or does this impact disability? And that's something that people can ask, and a way of having things explained to them. And it's like everything on that ballot is around disability rights. I don't think people realize that because people don't realize that, first of all, anybody can develop a disability or have a disability, but a large number of us live with a disability. And the other thing is that since COVID, I hope people realize that everybody has experienced some sort of trauma or mental health distress. That's sort of like what the rest of us that live with a lung disability are like. You are one of us. If anybody has realized how important it is to have us at the table, voting, especially since we lost so many of us, during this pandemic. There's, people with disabilities, or as the CDC would call them, with comorbidities, we had the worst outcomes of everybody. And it was not because we weren't telling them, is nobody was listening to us. Government has a problem telling the difference between hearing and listening. And sometimes when we advocate, they're just listening. But when we vote, that's when they have to hear, and that's probably the only time where, they kind of realize the difference. And now they have to hear us, and they hear you with your vote. And so I think, that's everything on everything. And it's kind of interesting because even if you don't have a voice, the vote, speaks for you or like sends that clear message, because that's something very ableist, and I apologize for that. But is that all, people don't know the difference between one and the other. And with voting, they make sure to listen. They take notice of what we're saying.
Thank you. Teresa, anything you'd like to add before we move on to the next question?
So just a quick thing today, every call that I took today or that I did, I said, happy voting day. And they were like, oh yes, it is voting day. So I did remind a few people, hey, don't forget to go vote. And it is so important. Don't forget, that everything that we do and touch is going to be on that ballot. One of the things I just want to mention locally, how much it affects what's going on with the housing in our country. There's a lot of things that happen with taxes and things that people are interested in when they go to look for property. And one of the great opportunities I had this year was to work with a lot of parents with disabilities, and to get to talk to them about, pay attention to what's on your property tax statement. It tells you a lot of secrets about where your money is going, and you may not be realizing it. And there's going to be things hiding on that ballot that you need to pay attention to, and that you want to study before you vote. And it could help you or it could hurt you. And so that was something I just wanted to add.
Thank you so much, Teresa. All right, next let's talk about barriers to voting. So what are some barriers that people with disabilities often experience, either voting by mail or voting in person when we go to vote?
Can I do it very quickly? One, because I know everybody has a really good one, but climate change. We're here in LA where it's raining really, really hard, and it rarely rains. We're not prepared to make sure that people with disabilities can travel during rain. and it's an election day. And this is kind of like a consequence of climate change, but there's other barriers that people are going to mention, but I just wanted to point that out because, it's like we were prepared for all sorts of things. The rain on election day is something that has thrown, especially because so much of it, it's actually the buses stopped a couple of minutes ago. And so, things like that, we have environmental barriers, but, beyond other things, I'm just thinking of like things like the climate, but I want other people, because I know other people are going to say the other ones, but I just find it, because it's cold over here. It's raining hard. So.
No, thanks so much. That's a great point. Ben, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
The biggest issue is not believing we're competent and have important opinions. Therefore, people believe we shouldn't have the same electoral processes. Another barrier is unequal access and lack of supports that make it possible to vote.
Definitely, that's really important. Thank you. Teresa, I see your hand. Go ahead.
One of the things that is really important to the folks that I get to work with is the accessible voting machine, and how frightening it was several times throughout this past year that access to that voting machine was at risk of being lost and going back to the old way of doing business with a paper ballot, and people losing the ability to use the machine that offers the private and independent vote that the Help America Vote Act speaks so highly of. The thing that we fought so hard for. One of the things that we've added this year was the use of the machine, and to remind people that you do not have to be an individual with a disability to ask to use that machine. You could be an individual who has difficulty reading the ballot, and it could be read to you, or you could get it in large print. Many other options are available to people, and we are not advertising that tool in a way that the world thinks of it as a usable tool. So we've started calling it the accessible voting computer, so that people think of it more friendly and more commonplace, and think of it when I forgot my glasses, when I went in to vote, or any other kind of assistance that might be helpful, or maybe English isn't your first language, or, being able to ask for those accommodations that are available on that very hard fought for tool that we have for voting.
Thank you, Teresa. Alyssa, go ahead.
Sure. I think everybody has really covered a lot of the barriers that we know about, including one that we don't always think about that Hector mentioned. But I do want to just touch on the fact that people with disabilities have a lot of rights in the voting process. So I just don't want that to get overlooked. And under the US Constitution, as well as a number of federal laws, including the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Voting Rights Act, Teresa mentioned the Help America Vote Act. So there are a number of laws that ensure, or are supposed to ensure, that people with disabilities have equal access to the ballot, that they aren't excluded, that they aren't disenfranchised without a legitimate reason, and that they get the help that they need, both in all aspects of the voting process. So, starting out with that, I think that there are so many areas for improvement that everyone has already really touched on. One thing, in addition to, what we think of as, inaccessible polling places and, paper ballots, or the need to print out a ballot, there are so many barriers that affect people because of the way state procedures and state laws restrict the right to assistance. And in particular, there are state guardianship laws that have that are maybe less well known, but that have a tremendous impact on people, on their ability to have the right to be registered to vote. So really important to keep in mind some of those state guardianship laws and practices that may take away the right to vote for people who have a guardian, even if the reason for the guardianship has nothing to do with voting. And people and institutions have huge barriers that other people don't necessarily face. And those could be the ability to get somebody to help them register or update their registration, to get and return a ballot, to get to the polls and things like that. So, I think those are important barriers that need to be addressed as well.
Thank you so much. I just want to acknowledge Alex Curran staff, one of ASAN staff members has their hand up. Go ahead, Alex.
Thank you, Zoe. I wanted to read for in the chat, Ben added in response to Teresa's statement, that is a very helpful tool. It would be terrible for that to break in regards to the accessible voting machines.
Thank you so much, Alex, for reading out the chat. And thank you to our panelists for this great discussion so far. The next thing that I wanted to address was the intersectionality of barriers to voting, how barriers to voting can be sort of compounded if you have multiple marginalized identities, for example, for disabled people of color. We've seen a lot of things that affect both of our communities, even attempts to pit our communities against each other, such as states that close polling places in neighborhoods that are primarily people of color and use as the reason that those polling places aren't ADA accessible. So we know we've seen voter suppression, both our communities face voter suppression. But if you could just address how barriers to voting can be compounded for people with multiple marginalized identities.
This is Hector. So that's actually a significant thing that I monitor because it happens very widespread, and the systematic way that it happens sometimes really does take a clear understanding of like all the different ways, both in which it impacts communities, but also the way that we have laws for it. And so oftentimes, you will find, particularly like, I'll speak from our Native American communities, some that live both in rural communities, reservations, and urban settings. In our rural communities, getting to those places, voting places, sometimes requires a significant amount of traveling. And there are not that many of them. When one of them closes for a variety of reasons, it really makes it incredibly difficult for people to be able to register. For many of our communities that don't necessarily have a fixed residence, either because of culture or the impact of poverty, in particularly our unhoused brothers and sisters and our siblings who might be coming out of detention centers or jails, registration or having the necessary IDs is a significant barrier for people to exercise that particular right. In our LGBTQIA community, a similar process takes place with our transgender siblings, where some states might not recognize their original name or preferred or specific gender, and it makes it very difficult for people that have multiple identities that get impacted by intersectionality. It just adds another barrier, another barrier, another barrier. Racism in some places plays a big thing. Some places having armed law enforcement nearby or just drive by. For many of us who have experienced violence by law enforcement, it's really very difficult. So we talk, for example, about having accessibilities. So things like having trauma-informed voting centers is like, making sure that the areas are safe for a community to feel not re-traumatized when we're going in those places is one of the biggest things that a lot of folks still don't understand. When we talk about accessibility and providing those types of accommodations. And so, there is still so much more work to be done because we know that so many of our siblings, that are showing up or online get turned away or there's somebody there. And sometimes when they get there, it's just really traumatizing. Even for those of us in the autistic community, sometimes I've had two instances in which, we had two autistic individuals have the police call on them because they thought that they were it was just really ableist kind of comments that they thought the person was on drugs or was having a mental health condition emergency. And it was like, no, that's who this person is. How dare you? And, just to have that experience not only, delayed the vote, in one case prevented it, but it's just, it has such a traumatic impact on our folks in many ways.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to call on Alex to read out the chat.
Thank you. This is Ben saying, I am very thankful that my state and county has a paper that I sign, and my communication/regulation partner and I both sign, and that very easily without issues allows me to have a person with me to assist me to make my vote.
Thank you so much. That's a great addition. Ben, I see you have your hand up next, so go ahead.
I think it becomes more difficult for other marginalizations in many ways. In finding someone who will protect them and their rights, and actually in the process of going to vote. I think some trans individuals might be denied because their ID does not look correct for their gender expression. But I don't think I am the most qualified to further discuss this.
Thank you, Ben. Is there anything else that anyone else wants to add on this before we move on to our next question? Alyssa,
So
I
really
see
quickly,
your...
I just
Oh,
wanted,
yeah.
this is Hector. I wanted to thank Bank for solidarity, because I think that's one of the things that we do really good in our community. So even if that's not an issue that I think, that comes from your experience, I really appreciate to highlight, because we have to uplift our most impacted folks as well as our most, marginalized. So thank you.
Absolutely.
I just wanted to add, in addition to what Hector and Ben said, that there's so many voter suppression laws that have been proposed and passed in the last couple of years, as well as the long history of voter suppression. Sometimes that's not directed at people with disabilities, although sometimes it is. But some of these laws have an incredibly detrimental impact on people with disabilities, and to the extent they are, they have other other identities and other ways that they are marginalized in the voting process, it compounds the problem. And just for one example, the Voting Rights Act, Section 208, allows people with disabilities to receive assistance from the person of their choice in all aspects of the voting process. And that same section of the Voting Rights Act also allows people who need an interpreter to receive that same assistance. And so many laws have been passed that restrict the kind of assistance that non-English speaking people can receive. But that, of course, impacts the right of people with disabilities to have the person of their choice assist them. And so there's been a lot of litigation around this, but I think even in practice and as it unfolds as at a practical level, it's a deterrent, because sometimes people, like in Texas, there's a requirement that the assister sign an oath, and maybe that's the case in other states as well. That's going to be a deterrent for someone who may be a paid staff person to be willing to sign an oath if there's a penalty attached to it. So there are all of these things that just compound.
Thank you so much. Ben, is your hand still up from last time, or do you have something else you want to add? Oh, it looks like it was just from last time speaking. All right, so the next question oh, Hector, go ahead before we move on.
Oh, Teresa had her hand up.
Then both of you go ahead before we move on.
No. So the other thing that I wanted to, another intersection, like in our Native community, when we talk about having material or translators or interpreters, we usually think like of things like Spanish or some of the other terrestrial languages. In our community, our elders, our seniors, are the ones that are preserving some of our languages that are slowly being erased. So some of our elders only sometimes have that language. There was a story about how in Arizona we are having now a lot of the material transmitted into Hopi and to some of the other terrestrial languages that our elders, who are people with disabilities, need to be able to vote. And so they translated, which is like original languages, and they actually have in some of those places, they actually have volunteer interpreters and translators in those original languages, so that when our seniors come in, they have that similar disability access support. Similarly, we have some of our older residents that have also a lot of language proficiency in their home language that are also part of the disability community when they come in. And so sometimes accessing disability accommodation services are not always there in their preferred language. And so it adds that other kind of barrier. And, it's just something else that is kind of big built in, that because a lot of people think that only people with disabilities should only speak English, sort of thing. And so that's kind of like the embedded racism in that, that kind of accommodations make it difficult. So that's just another example of that racial intersection for our community.
Absolutely, that we should be able to receive all kinds of assistance at the same time that we need. It shouldn't be only one or the other thing. Teresa, go ahead.
I just wanted to mention that our Go Voter project does have a survey that we have worked really hard to make sure that it's online and that it's a printable document that people can take to meetings when they have self-advocacy meetings, so that they can go over it together and get the personal direct examples from people. And this really helped us when we were trying to identify how people get information about voting. And the reason I thought this was perfect timing for this was that because of our efforts to reach into the local communities and find out how people get information, we are still finding that over half of the voters that filled out our surveys who were African American still do not prefer getting their information online. They are still going for the traditional routes of getting information. And I think this is really important for us to remember, that when we're creating information, that we remember that there is a large part of our population that does not get their information online, and that we remember to reach out locally through groups of networks and try to make sure that they have the information that they need to stay fully informed during the process of voting, and to know when things happen, especially when we've had several incidences of ballot misprintings and things like that, that some of the voters wouldn't have known about if they hadn't had their local networks through our Latin communities. So that would have been really difficult to get, to everyone, had they not had their extensive network of reaching out to each other and keeping each other informed.
Thank you so much, Teresa. Anything else for folks on that before we move on to the next question? All right, so the next thing I wanted to talk about is policy change and systemic change. And let's address, if we can, what kind of change do we want to see to make voting possible for all people with disabilities? So like, what are the policy changes and the changes at the systems level that would help make that possible? Ben, I see your hand, go ahead.
Proper supports and access. I need a support person to help me communicate and vote, and to get me to a polling location. Without these supports and understanding of my competence, I would be unable to vote. So many others are not as lucky as I am.
Thank you, Ben. Yeah, that's really important. Hector, go ahead.
This is Hector. So two things. Definitely, we can spend billions and billions of dollars on the military, which is fantastic. But just like we can prioritize so much money for other things, we need to prioritize accessibility for voting. That's just fundamental. Voting is our most fundamental right as members of this democracy. Then secondly, I think that all electorates, and definitely counties and states and federal, agencies that focus on voting, on designing regulations and laws and having staff, should have people with disabilities there. Not necessarily advising, but working there, directing, being part of those conversations. It is a point of equity of total magnitude that I think really needs to be prioritized. And I've had people say that why is that necessary? And my answer is pretty clearly COVID. We have lost so many U.S. residents and people with disabilities, whose vote mattered and does still. our community has been, it is because the pandemic's not over. You know, we're dying in mass. And I say this as somebody who not only lost friends but family members to COVID. You know, and I see that as being, you know, still our ongoing survival issue. Our vote should matter more than anything else. You know, because the likelihood of us, you know, having to continue having worse outcomes is only continuing because, you know, our elected officials and members of our community have deemed us expendable. And as human beings, that's unacceptable. When we come to the table, sort of speaking, we're not just there by ourselves. We have on both sides of us friends and members that have died and who should have been at that table. And so I always remind that of that. And people think that I'm being dramatic or too urgent, and I am. If people don't understand the urgency behind that, then again, you know, it's that problem between listening and hearing. It is that urgent because it is our lives. Our lives are on the line. The lives of our siblings. We might not all be related by blood, but we are related by survival. We are a long-standing community that is not new. We have a shared history. Our language is accessibility. Our traditions are advocacy. We are a cultural community just like everybody else. If something of this magnitude was happening to a particular race and ethnic community like it does, like the urgency that we see with our brothers and sisters in Ukraine or our immigrants, this is a similar type of human rights crisis that we have. And, you know, I dare anybody tell me that it's not urgent and it's not dramatic and it's not that important. You know, I dare anybody to tell any of us that we should not be leading this process.
Thank you so much. Alyssa, I see your hand up.
I think Teresa had her hand up also. Did you want to speak, Teresa, or did you put your hand down?
Go ahead, Alyssa.
Okay. I agree with everything Hector and Ben just said. And I think, you know, in a nutshell, what we need that would make a huge difference is federal standards and federal funding for things like using technology for in-person and remote voting to make sure that people aren't forced to use paper when it's not accessible to them, money for training elections officials, as well as purchasing and maintaining voting equipment so that people don't find that the accessible voting equipment is not in good working order, as well as additional tools to adapt additional inaccessible polling places. But in addition to those things that come to mind, we also really need federal standards to prevent the voter suppression laws that we see all over the country, and that, you know, so that people with disabilities don't find that they have certain rights in one state that they don't have in another state. And that includes a standard that guardianship laws can't automatically disenfranchise people because they have a guardian, or disenfranchise people, you know, putting the burden on the person to show that they are competent to vote. So things like that are critically important to just make sure that voting is actually free and fair anywhere you live in this country. You know, I think we also, as I said earlier, we have really strong federal protections, but I think we also need more enforcement and more guidance to clarify that some of the state laws and practices that we see are not in compliance with those federal protections.
Absolutely. Teresa, is there anything you wanted to add?
I just wanted to add a little bit about something that we may talk more about in a moment, but one of the things that comes to mind for me, in addition to all of the wonderful things that everybody has said, is that I think that there's this pre-drawn thing that we do not teach about voting to people once they get a little bit older in school. I think that there's a big misunderstanding, there's confusion about it, and people who are in segregated classrooms, that's still happening, segregated schools. They're not all learning about this and about the rights that individuals have. That's why there's this block about thinking that we're not smart enough or that we can't do it. And the family messages are not strong in saying your child is, going to learn these things, and, they're going to have support from people with disabilities to help them learn and understand it too. And that there needs to be money to help us get into the schools and help them understand how they as adults will get this opportunity, and to know that they are smart enough. It's born into you to make decisions, and you're going to make good decisions about you.
Thank you so much, Teresa. So now that we've covered what some of the barriers are to voting and some of the structural change that needs to happen in order to make voting more equitable and more possible for people with disabilities, what can we do? So what can we, as individuals, as voters, as people with disabilities, what can the folks who are watching this webinar right now do to help make that systemic change? Alyssa, go ahead.
Well, first and foremost, vote. if you haven't voted yet, again, get to your polling place if it's still open, stay in line, vote all the way up and down the ballot, and encourage your friends and family members to vote. So that's the most important thing, because that is the way we express our opinions, and it also is the way we hold elected officials accountable. So that is, of course, the most important thing that I assume people know. But there's also a way that people can advocate for pro-voter policies that affect people with disabilities, even if it's not something you need personally. So, one issue, as we've talked about with accessible voting machines not being in good working order, is sometimes they don't get used very often. So the poll workers don't know how to use them, or they're in disrepair. Everybody should use them. They shouldn't be limited just to people who need them because they have a print disability, or some other disability that requires using that machine. They should be available to anybody, so that people who do need them can continue to vote privately and don't have to disclose that they have a disability in order to use it. But it will help make sure that it's more like curb cuts, where they were developed for physical accessibility and everybody uses them. So there are a lot of easy things that people can do in their day-to-day lives, but also using your voice and your platform in lots of other ways, talking to your elected officials, calling your protection and advocacy agency if you have a particular issue or you want to get involved in outreach and training, using your social media platform to talk about the importance of accessibility features and why all aspects of voting should be accessible to people with disabilities. So there's lots that everybody can do.
Thank you so much. Go ahead, Teresa.
I just wanted to add that many people with disabilities get services, and they have to put goals on a plan. And one of the goals on my plan is to get assistance with voting. I need help to have somebody read the information to me. I need to have somebody sometimes fill in the little circles for me when my hands are not quite working that day, because it's different every day. And I need to make sure that it's written into my plan that I have a driver. We have many plans that people are asked to do. Supported decision-making is in many states. You can write this into your supported decision-making plan. You can write it into your service plan so that your staff can help you and others can be built into your plan to help you. The people that you trust the most, to make sure that your wishes are put on that ballot and that you know who it is that's helping you, and you believe that they will make sure that if their assistance is needed, they will do what you are asking.
Thank you for that really important tip to people directing their services. I think that's great. Ben or Hector, anything you want to add?
This is Hector. If you're in line, stay in line. Again, but I think that goes beyond that, because for the people that voted, I love you so much. We all love you so much for having done that. You're fantastic. If that makes you feel a little bit good, then think about how good one of your friends or family members will feel if you call them right now and say, have you voted? Are you in line? Oh, you voted already? You're fantastic. Thank you for doing that. Let them know. Let them know that what they did was really important, and let them know why it was important to you. If you want to do that, and if you don't want to do that, definitely stay in line. Also means keep engaged. And have this be kind of like the beginning of. I like New Year's. New Year's is a great day. For me, voting day is my New Year's. I celebrate after it's done because I know it takes probably a couple of weeks before we completely get all the results for all the places. But for me, I think it's kind of like the beginning of my year because I do hold my elected officials accountable. I take people with their little stickers and I say, "These are the people that voted for you. Let's work together." And like these are your constituents. These are the ones that voted for you. And your next election cycle, you want them to vote for you. And I know it's just the day after voting, but that's how it works. And just let them know that you're excited, that you're concerned, and that you mean business. Again, you're coming in. You're coming in with the work that you're doing, not alone. Every state has a protection advocacy agency and disability organization that you can reach out and find out about what they're doing for voting. Get on their boards, get on their board of directors. As a community member, you don't have to be a lawyer to be in any of our boards, community boards. You don't have to have a PhD or anything. You're just a person. I'm a regular person. Somebody who has been institutionalized. They've had me in jail. I've been homeless on the street. I'm just a regular person, and get on the boards and make the world know how powerful you are. Because in our Native community, we talk about our elders, our ancestors who have passed, the people that we relate in our culture. In the disability community, we have our disability folks as our ancestors. So you're not alone. You're not walking alone. We just lost one of our ancestors recently, who had done very important work for all of us. You're not alone, when you're going in the room, even if you feel like you are, and know that the work that you're doing, has a lot of possibilities. It's your new year. Make a resolution, a plan. What am I going to do now that I voted with this? This is what am I going to do with that sticker? Label it or laminate it or something. When you go to your elected official, this is me. I'm your elected voter. That means a lot. That's how much power you have. And don't ever let anybody tell you differently. I think that's what I would do. Stay in line.
Thank you so much. Ben, anything on ways that folks could make change before we move on to our next question?
Vote. When elected officials have our best interests in mind and are willing to stand up for our safety and our rights, that is how we as a country can implement systematic change. Speak up for your beliefs and be the change you want to see. You can also write to officials to express your voice in important matters.
Thank you so much. I want to let our audience at home know, I have one last panel question, then I'm going to start taking Q&A. So if you have any questions, feel free to pop it in the chat here on Zoom or on YouTube, wherever you're watching. But my next question for the panel is, what can people do if they're not old enough yet to vote? How can people get involved in civic engagement? How can people get involved in advocating for voting accessibility and voting rights against voter suppression? What can folks do who aren't old enough to vote yet? Ben, go ahead.
So many things. Start by educating yourself on politics, voting, economics, etc. Assess what you are most passionate about and which party best aligns with your ideals. Volunteer to help get voters registered and educated about the candidates. You can also volunteer at polling locations. Even if you can't vote yet, you can still make a difference. Also, make sure people know their votes do, in fact, count.
Well said, Ben. Thank you so much, Ben. Anyone else? Alyssa, go ahead.
Yeah, +1 to what Ben said. That's exactly right. And I just want to add that in some make sure you know what your state laws are. I know that in California, if you're 16, you can pre-register. And Berkeley and Oakland actually passed ordinances that allow people who are 16 to be able to vote in local or school board elections. So I don't think it's actually live yet, but it may be that in other places you can vote if you're not 18. But exactly what Ben said, and also really make sure that your family and friends are voting and that they know how their vote affects you. So there's a ton that people who are not old enough to vote can do. And again, you know, young people often have a social media platform. So amplify the importance of voting on your social media, be visible there so that people in your community and on your in your feed know that the voting rights that are important to you are something that they can help protect.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. Anyone else? Oh, Teresa, I see your hand. Go ahead.
I was just thinking how much it would have meant to me to have a young person be the person that assists me when I am going through the voting information and learning how to use those tools. A lot younger would have really helped, and it could have helped us also continue to improve the information that's being made available in a much friendlier format, and to always fight for that access, I think is really important. You can help everyone to be involved in voting. You just have to figure out what it is that you want to do.
And this
Thank
is
you so
Hector.
much. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know about any of you, but the fact that you're not old enough to vote doesn't sound right with me. So if it doesn't sound right with you either, you know, there are things that you could do it. And I say that because as a person of color, like I remember that a lot of my relatives didn't live that long. A lot of, you know, and so I know that happens, you know, in a lot of our communities, and particularly in the disability community, there's always that possibility. And so we like, what's the point of having to wait until we're gone? You know, that's kind of a very important situation to kind of discuss. You know, I know there's like constitutional limits for like what age you can vote perhaps for certain elections, but that doesn't mean everything. You know, this is not, again, one of those like all or none kind of issues. And like I really love the work that is being done in here, California, particularly in Oakland, with our young folks, you know, our young siblings, you know, because of that issue. You know, many folks sometimes, you know, have really important points, and they're residents, they're part of our community. How old do you have to be part of our community? It shouldn't matter, you know, when we're trying to solve things like this. When we're trying to solve so much, we're trying to solve so much. There's so much work to be done. And if we have people that want to show up to vote, that want to help change the system, we shouldn't have to tell them, you know, not until you're this age. It's not only ages, but it reminds me like people like myself couldn't vote before we had to take an IQ test. We had to learn how to read. We had to, like, all these kind of barriers that just made it difficult, you know, but yet everything around me impacts me. Everybody's decisions impacts me. You know, if we learn anything through COVID, is that no matter how much we do to take care of ourselves, is what other people are also doing, you know, that we don't have any control, that ultimately impacts us. Climate warming, you know, many of us want to be able to make sure that we can do as much as we can, but then we also have younger people who are really leading this. Why should they have to wait, you know, until they're old enough, you know, for those kind of opinions to happen? The neurodivergent community is very similar. You know, we always get kind of not until then kind of situation. It's like, says who? Where did it say? It's that doesn't feel right. And I think, you know, if you're young enough, ask why. Ask why. Ask why. This, my siblings hate me when they have their children for the first time. The one word that I always teach them is why. And I do it for fun, but I also do it so they can understand that. And they hate me, my sisters, because they're like, they won't stop saying that over and over. Like, that's kind of funny. But I also tell my friends, ask why, ask lots of questions, and be part of the process. You'll get there, but you don't have to wait until then for everything. And you might be Oakland, or some other place in California. If people are listening to you, maybe you'll get them to hear you in this. You are a resident, you are a member of our community from the moment we are born, and that's a big issue, to the moment we die. And at no point in our life, does it make sense that choice to vote comes and goes, because it does happen sometimes as we get older. They take that away from us. So it's an interesting conversation. Enjoy it. If you have family members that voted, thank them. If other ones didn't, say like, hey, I wanted my vote. It's very important not to waste your vote. And I think those conversations are very important to have. There's not a lot of things that we can guarantee people, but your right to vote is one that we should probably do.
Thank you. I'm going to call on Alex to read the chat, then we'll take questions from our attendees.
Thank you, Zoe. This is Alex, and I am reading Ben message a couple times in the chat. First, saying, I often use my public Facebook page to discuss voting rights, like talking about this event. Here is the link, and he links to his Facebook page. And then a second one is, and my Instagram is, and then there's the link to the Instagram. And then in reply to Hector, says, yes, this is so true, Hector. Young people are still such a part of the community.
Thank you, Alex. We have some questions, two from Mira, who asks, how can OTs, occupational therapists, help to increase voting accessibility? And how can we assist patients with Alzheimer's or dementia, especially in the advanced stages, to vote? So I welcome any thoughts from our panelists on those questions. Alyssa, go ahead.
Sure. Well, I think they're sort of related. So I assume OT means occupational therapist. And, I think there are lots of ways that OTs can assist people. They can just talk to them about voting. I mean, in their sessions or in their meetings with them, they can talk and make sure that they have a voting plan, make sure they have the help they need, but also, if there's work that needs to be done around actually marking a ballot, completing a ballot, there are ways that people can have the opportunity to practice filling out a ballot. But I think that there are so many ways that people may need or want help. And it's really important that people in their network, in their circle of support, are talking to them about what it's going to take for them to vote. So, for instance, people with Alzheimer's, unless they've had their right to vote legally taken away by a court, even people who have Alzheimer's should have the legal right to vote. It's just that often that right is overlooked by their family members or their caregivers. So talking to them about that is a really important first step, but also making sure that they have access to information in a method that they can understand. There are so many resources out there, plain language, easy read materials. The one limitation as a staff person or a caregiver or anybody, a family member or friend, is that you can't vote for the person. So you can't substitute your own choice for the choice of the person who's voting. So for instance, for someone with Alzheimer's, if they can express a choice, even if it's nodding their head or saying yes or no to the options available, that's expressing their choice, and that's perfectly legal. If they can't express their choice, then that part of the ballot should just remain blank. But otherwise, people with Alzheimer's or other cognitive disabilities should have the same opportunity to vote as anybody else.
Thank you, Alyssa. Anyone else on those questions, what occupational therapists can do and how to help people with dementia vote? Teresa, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
I do agree with Alyssa that part of it is just asking people, is this something for folks that are older and experiencing the worry whether they can do that or not? asking if they're in facilities, asking if the facility can host events and participate in learning from candidates and other people by doing some kind of speaking engagement or training to make that available to the group. Many states do offer options of people coming to locations and assisting through bipartisan representation, helping them register, helping them get their information. They can ask their staff to assist them during the process of learning. And then, they can also ask for those folks to return from the PNA or other voting officials can come to those locations and set that up so that they and all of the other folks and facilities can vote. And as far as OTs, I think it's just asking people, what is it that you would like to do? Is there a goal that you have around voting? Is there some thing that you want to learn how to do, or how to be more independent during the voting process? And if you do need help, what would that help look like? Let's talk to your staff. Let's help train them how they can best assist you when you go to vote.
Thank you so much. Is there anything anyone else would like to add before we move on to our next question from the audience? All right, so the next question that I see we have from an anonymous attendee who asks, what are some recommended voting accommodations for terminally ill people who are worried they won't live long enough to election day? I would say here, obviously, if you're terminally ill and you're in a place that has early voting, that's one I would recommend. I don't know if anyone would like to speak more about that or anything else that they'd like to recommend here.
This is Hector, and so I've had I've had scenarios where I've had friends and people that I've known in that situation. Particularly, people talk about how COVID is like an unprecedented epidemic, but we've had continuous epidemics in many of our communities. And one H1 epidemic, AIDS epidemic hasn't ended. In our native communities, we have had a significant amount of experience with this particular one issue as well, because for many of our folks, voting not only was of significant importance, but it was important for our community to have as many numbers as possible being able to represent. And I have seen a variety of ways in which in the palliative care for folks, as one of the things that they're kind of working to settle or to make them feel comfortable, to know that that's something that, it's always a goal. I know we have early registration and mail-in ballots, but we've had occasions in which locations where folks are getting near make that accommodation, just even having that planning ahead of time. There's no proxy ballot in those situations, I think, but definitely informing to people and the staff and the family about how important it is for this individual, to use some of their kind of lost remaining energies while they're here with us, and to be kind of a communal process of support if possible, if either by the provider or the agency, but even as a community or members, and realizing that that's kind of our last wishes in these places. But I know there are technicalities, particularly because it's non-proximity, so I'll leave the legalities to Elisa. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not giving advice. I always definitely encourage people to check in with their agencies and PNIs, but it's important if people are planning to use some of their last minutes, just how important this is. So.
Thank you so much. Alyssa, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add a couple things. One is that state laws vary. Some states won't count a vote that is cast if the person is no longer alive by election day. But some states specifically allow that vote to be counted. So I think, Zoe, you were correct. Early vote, vote by mail, vote as soon as possible. Also, a number of states have specific provisions for people who are hospitalized, kind of on an emergency basis, and so can't execute the voting plan that maybe they had intended. So it would be important to know what the state law is around, if the person ends up being hospitalized. So that would be a good thing to do, to call your state protection and advocacy and find out in that situation what the person's rights are.
Absolutely. Really recommend state P&As when you're unsure about your voting rights. I see we have one more question in the chat, which I'm going to read out. Where can we find resources to help us understand what local budget proposals and other changes are actually saying on ballots? I often find the language confusing and think a proposal is doing the opposite of what it actually will.
And so this is Hector. So this is one of the reasons that I love ASAN. So the plain language voter guide information that this group has been putting for years is really allowing broader conversations that need to take place with our elected kind of offices. Requesting, going to your elected, kind of like your registrar's office or your county officials, and making that disability request accommodation for plain language is a beginning, because it's an actual accommodation that we can make. And that means making sure that not only the material that is being written is done in a way that we can understand, not just the people that are writing it, but to have even individuals kind of at the sites explain to us or help us be able to really access the information that we are being asked to vote at, because it's all about being an informed voter. And not only do we have the right to vote, but we have a right to ask about what is this, that we're being asked to. And it shouldn't have to wait until the last minute, but sometimes it does. And those voting things can be very complicated, and I think sometimes they're done on purpose to really kind of confuse people. And I think it's important to remember that plain language is a big accommodation, in the disability community, but it's also for everybody else. Because, like I spend a lot of my time explaining things to people who supposedly don't have disabilities, because they can't make, left or right about what's in front of them. Because it's particularly, I think, sometimes designed to be confusing. And so being able to have that support, when it's being written and when it's being sent out, is one of the things that we're able to kind of advocate for. And some places might be more responsive than others. So this is kind of how we continue doing the work that we're doing, because this is one of the things that I think, goes back to having federal standards, that really, take those things into consideration. Because that's again making sure the whole process is accessible. So having those conversations with your elected officials, especially if you voted for them, we want to make sure that you understand when you vote for them next time, right? You kind of put it that way. I want to make sure I don't misunderstand, and vote for somebody else. So can you please, have a law pass on this, or have something changed, or again, how can I work to change this? I think those are some of the kind of fire starter conversations that we can have.
Thank you so much. Ben says in the chat, I think the plain language request needs. I don't know, Ben, if you got cut off in the middle of that, or if you were just trying to make a point about the importance of plain language, which I definitely agree with. Oh, but it needs to be more known, definitely. Alyssa, go ahead.
I would also add, sometimes what's on the ballot is really confusing and things kind of read or seem to be the opposite of what they actually are. So plain language is an important way for voter information to be more accessible. And sometimes just talking to people. This is how everybody votes, is talking to trusted people, whether it's your friends or organizations that are in your community that you trust, if it's a Center for Independent Living or an ARC chapter or People First chapter or some group that is familiar with what's happening at the local or state level. Just try to get as much information, even if it's in casual conversation. Sometimes neighborhood groups are really helpful. Just ask your neighbors, well, what do you think about this? Where are you getting your information? Is there a way we can get together and talk about this? So informal ways of getting educated is often really useful, on especially more local issues.
Definitely, thank you. We have an attendee who has their hand raised, Mira. Mira, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, sorry. Sometimes I have trouble typing because I have carpal tunnel. But I was just wondering, so I'm a physician assistant student hoping to go into hospice care, and I'm just wondering what the where we can look up the state by state regulations for legislation on how voters who are terminally ill who might not make it to election day can maybe get their vote counted, because I've encountered quite a few situations like that working in healthcare, and I want to make sure that I try to honor final wishes.
Thank you so much, Mira. Any of our panelists want to take that? Alyssa, it looks like your hand is still up.
Yeah, well, I think, just building on what I said earlier, I don't know if there was like more of a response, but some states do allow a ballot to be counted even if a person passes away by election day. Some states don't, but getting the ballot in as soon as possible is really important. And also a lot of states have specific laws for people who are hospitalized on an emergency basis, so they can't execute their voting plan as intended. So those are two ways to help people who may be terminally ill to be able to vote as one of their final acts.
Thank you. It's just that a lot of my patients are on home hospice.
Yeah, if you're not sure about the laws in your state specifically, one of the things you can do is contact your protection and advocacy agency, which you can usually find by looking up disability rights and the name of your state. And that is often how they're named. And you can ask them, what are the rights about terminally ill people voting in my area? And they can help answer that question for you. We have one more question from the audience. My question is regarding voter motivation. It's extremely discouraging when I see politicians in my state on both sides of the aisle ignore the needs and perspectives of the disabled community. How do you convince someone their vote matters when their representatives treat their entire community as invisible? And this is a really great question. And I know it can be really frustrating to keep voting if you're not seeing change. So what would you say to that question? Teresa, I see your hand up. Go ahead.
One of the things that we work on during our trainings too is this issue, because it is really, a true issue for us is to make sure that we are all going. A lot of people register but don't vote, and it is frustrating. But one of the things that we find that's really helpful, a lot of people will not do things necessarily for themselves. But when you talk about a child or friend or family members that are experiencing lack of services, lack of support, dangerous situations, things where a need is that about in this person's life, sometimes that awakens something inside them that helps them to see that, yes, it is very important that they do step up at this time, because not everything is about them. It is about all of us as a community stepping up and supporting each other, and knowing that the things that we do really do help a lot more than just us. We just happen to benefit from it also. And sometimes that really helps people to open it up and say, yes, I do need to be strong enough, brave enough, push through my fears, get help to push through those fears, get the support I need to be the one that helps my family or friend get the things that they need.
Thank you so much, Teresa. In the chat, I want to just want to read Ben's comment. Ben says, you can speak up and demand they address it by calling or emailing elected officials. Nothing about us without us situation. Thank you, Ben. We are coming up on our time for this panel. Is there any last thoughts that our panelists would like to add either to this question or just about voting and civic engagement in general before we close out?
This is Hector. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Teresa.
Oh, I just wanted to say our slogan for our Go Voter project is I shape history every time I vote. And we have that on our shirts, and people really relate to that because what you see might not be seen for a little while. What you think is going to happen may take a little while for it to happen, but keep fighting for it because it is worth it. It is worth stepping up and changing history every time you vote.
Thank you so much. Hector, go ahead.
Yeah, this is Hector. You know, the National Disability Rights Network, we are a nonpartisan organization. And we just celebrated our big anniversary a couple of months ago. When we were created because somebody ran a story about horrible conditions in one of our institutions. It was Gerardo, you know, the person who ran out really perhaps might seem very conservative and controversial to some people. Because of his story that he did, it brought motivation from both the Republicans and the Democrats, and the network was created. One of the things that disability has, among all issues, is that it's something that exists among all of us. And sometimes it feels like we're not able to really connect with one of our party leaders or elected officials, really to work with what's going on. And I have to tell you, everything takes time. And one little vote actually can tip the scale at any time. Never forget that. One single vote can always tilt the scale. If not now, then at one point or another. That's how justice happens, unfortunately. And it takes people showing up and voting or mailing or calling people or helping people to vote, you know, to kind of get that going. And little by little, we've come a long way. I am now 47 years old, and every night I still remember what it was like to be locked up in that institution as a kid. And I never thought I was going to be able to leave. You know, that was before a lot of this loss happened. And I look at, you know, all the great people now doing the same work, and I'm like, oh my God, you know, we didn't have that. You know, somebody tells me that when they inspire people, they don't give them like their torch. You know, they think I'm just going to hand off my torch. They say not to do that. They say they just light other people's fires. And that's what you do when you vote. You know, you really kind of a bigger process. And it might not seem like that at the time, but just think back of where we've been, you know, and where we could possibly go. We're seeing some really disturbing trends, you know, around civil rights, and you know, we're in this together. We're in this together because our lives are really at stake here. You know, and that one vote that you put, you know, has as much meaning that people on their last moments are trying to make sure to realize just how powerful that is. Don't let anybody take that from you. And just, again, like I said, you're fantastic for having voted today. You know, you are part of what makes things better. And I think nobody can take that away from you.
Thank you so much for those final thoughts. I'm going to read Ben's comment in the chat. Thank you so much for having me as part of this event tonight. And everyone remember, your voice matters. Thank you, Ben. Alyssa, I see your hand. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to think about, we started off this event remembering Lois Curtis, who was such a trailblazer in bringing a case because she wanted to get out of an institution. And that case went all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court
Oh no, Alyssa, I think you're frozen.
fed into that result. I mean, the Supreme Court justices are, oh shoot, I'm going to shut the camera. I'm having connection issues. The Supreme Court justices are nominated by the president and confirmed by people in the Senate. And so every time you vote, you are impacting those kinds of decisions. And so they may be indirect and they may not happen all at once. And I like to think of voting as riding a bus, like if the bus that takes you directly to your destination doesn't come, you don't just go home or continue to sit at the bus stop. You take the bus that's going as close to where you need to be as possible, and then you take the next bus. And so voting is kind of like that. And it's important to do all of these things that we're talking about: voting, speaking up, advocating, using your social media platform, all of these things to make your voice heard and make an impact. And then sometimes you don't notice that you've made such an impact until you look backwards and you see what everything that you've done has amounted to in total.
Thank you so much. That's really important explanation. All right, we are just about out of time. I want to thank all of our panelists again for all of their thoughts. It's been great having you. This has been a wonderful discussion about voting and the importance of voting. Thank you to everyone attending. Thank you for voting today. Thank you for being here for our conversation. You can see ASAM's resources on voting on our website. We have a toolkit called Your Vote Counts, which explains the voting process as well as some things about voter suppression. You can see SABE's Go Voter project on their website, or just Google SABE Go Voter, and you can see their survey, which you should take after you vote. And if you need any explanation about voting in your local community, you can always contact your P&A, and you can find that by searching Protection and Advocacy Agency in the name of your state or territory, or looking up disability rights plus the name of your state or territory. Thank you all again so much. I'm going to end the panel now. It's been great having you.
Thank you so much.